And on that note, what a wonderful way to begin an opera. And this evening, what a wonderful way to end a fabulous, fabulous opera season with Virginia Opera. My name is Joshua Bort, and I'm so excited to welcome you to Le Nozze di Figaro, the Marriage of Figaro, the final offering of the 2021-2022 opera season. What a journey it has been. And I just have to say, for this inaugural year of these digital previews, it's been an honor and a joy to shepherd you through these incredible works ranging from Das Rheingold to Rodolfo Remembers, Three Decembers, and now one of my favorite operas of all time and my favorite opera to talk about, Le Nozze di Figaro. We have many different subjects to address across the course of the next hour or so. And I want to begin, as always, with a disclaimer. There is no test. I repeat, there is no test. However, I'm going to be discussing a lot. I'm going to be bringing up a lot of different ideas and a lot of terms. My purpose here this evening is not to overwhelm anyone with information, but to actually give you facts, give you approaches to thinking about this masterpiece that we return to again and again and again. This is one of the most famous and one of the most performed operas. And I hope that by this end of our time together this evening, or if you're watching this recorded, the time that we're sharing wherever and whenever that is taking place, that you have some new hooks into this piece, different ways of thinking about it. Whether this is your first time or your 30th time of approaching this opera, we can always learn more, and we can always be shocked into being delighted in the freshness, the fun, and the drama of this charming classic work. When talking about opera, we are talking about an international art form. And Le Nozze di Figaro, The Marriage of Figaro, is one of the best examples I can think of what we mean when we say an international art form. In The Marriage of Figaro, we have an opera written by a German-speaking Austrian composer, written in Italian, set in Spain, based on a French play. You do not get more cosmopolitan, you do not get more European, you do not get more facets to look at with this, with any work than you do Le Nozze di Figaro. And I'm going to be structuring our time looking at this piece from all of these different sides, looking at it from the French perspective, from the French source material, looking at it from the German perspective, and learning about Mozart himself. Again, I hope that all of these different approaches and different ways in will help bring this piece to life, and you will realize that it is just as vital to us today as it was when it premiered in 1786. Le Nozze di Figaro, with its fantastic 18th century costumes, of which you'll see on the stage in just a couple weeks with this Virginia Opera production, is kind of seen as the height of opera itself. It's centuries old, it's long, it's in a foreign language, they're wearing fancy costumes. But underneath the surface, this is a deeply political opera. And when it premiered, it was completely contemporaneous. The costumes that they saw on stage were the clothing that you saw in the audience. As far as 18th century audiences were concerned, the singers on stage may as well have been wearing jeans and t-shirts. This was a contemporary act, and I hope that our time together brings that to life in some surprising ways. So let's go ahead and get started with Le Nozze di Figaro and talk about the overview before we dive into some of these different perspectives on the work itself. What are we talking about when we talk about The Marriage of Figaro? Well, we are talking about a 4-act opera with a score, with music by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, one of his best, and a libretto or text by Lorenzo Da Ponte. Lorenzo Da Ponte is one of the most kind of wild characters in all of Western classical music. We'll dive into his life in just a couple of moments, as well as spend quality time with Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart himself. This opera is based on the second play of a three-play trilogy by the French playwright Beaumarchais. Now, you may be wondering, why the second play? We'll get to that in a second. Why didn't Mozart and Da Ponte, why didn't they adapt to the first? Hold that thought, because that is a great question and gets at the heart of why this piece still speaks so brilliantly to us today. But it's important to know that when we are thrown into the world of Marriage of Figaro, we are thrown not only into the middle of a story, but in the middle of the trilogy. Imagine watching The Lord of the Rings and being thrown into the Two Towers, or the second Harry Potter film, or the second Star Wars, whatever your trilogy you wish to discuss. We're being thrown into the middle. And we'll talk about the ramifications of that in just a moment. This piece premiered in Vienna in 1786 at the Berg Theater, receiving royal patronage. That is also a big deal, as we will see. And as I mentioned, this is a truly continental opera. All of the issues that were roiling in Europe at this time, all of the thoughts and ideas that Mozart had are coming together all as one. Politics and culture and gender and society, all of these things are coming to a head. The Figaro trilogies, and in particular, The Marriage of Figaro, Le Nozze di Figaro, was banned when it premiered. And as we know, when things are banned, they tend to get very popular. And so, the reason why, I would assert, Mozart and Da Ponte went with The Marriage of Figaro is it was the most relevant to the situation that was developing in Europe at that time. As we talk about the plot of The Marriage of Figaro and also The Barber of Seville, the first of those plays, because it's important to know where we're coming from, keep this in mind. We are only a decade after American independence, after the, scrappy colonies had usurped their colonial oppressors, and we are only 3 years away from the French Revolution. To say that Europe was on edge, to say that the world order felt unstable, is a huge understatement. And that's why this play was banned. Let's talk a little bit about the play itself and Beaumarchais. Because as I said, understanding this play, understanding the way that it was read at that time, is important for us to be able to approach this opera with fresh eyes. So, the first of this trilogy is The Barber of Seville, famously set by Giacomo Rossini just a couple decades after Mozart's opera premiered. And in The Barber of Seville, we have a kind of classic rescue story. This was very popular in the 1700s. The idea of a young hero going off to rescue the damsel in distress was told again and again and again. Mozart himself even had set a rescue opera in The Abduction from the Seraglio. Other operas of the time use the similar plot. And so Beaumarchais begins his Figaro trilogy with a rescue opera. We meet the dashing young Count Almaviva, and he's everything you expect of a Spaniard. And he has fallen in love with the beautiful Rosina. Rosina is a ward of Dr. Bartolo. To be a ward is to be a young woman in the care of an older gentleman. It's a relationship that doesn't really exist in contemporary circles. There wasn't anything necessarily immoral about this in any way. It was simply providing for this young woman before she's brought out into society. But Dr. Bartolo has realized that he is actually going to marry Rosina because he wants her money. When the Count finds out about this, he is desperate, and so he gets the traveling factotum, the barber of the title, a jack of all trades, to help him get into the house and rescue the girl and win the day. That is the plot of The Barber of Seville. Pretty conventional, but we've met our main characters. We've met our wily, scrappy barber, lower class, that's important to remember. We've met the young lovers, the Count Almaviva and Rosina. and we've met her captor, Dr. Bartolo, who at the end relents to the marriage of the Count and Countess, or becoming Countess, Rosina, but is kind of simmering with resentment, as we will see. Bartolo is helped by Don Basilio, a music master who's very scheming and full of kind of wiles. And these are the characters that populate that first piece. Pretty basic, pretty conventional in all ways. Beaumarchais, however, upped his game in The Marriage of Figaro because he realized that the kind of perfect ending of The Barber and the very conventional nature of it didn't really tell the full story. So The Marriage of Figaro, the second play, begins several years later, and the marriage between the Count and the Countess has gone stale. The Countess is not happy, the Count is not happy, and things are not quite as rosy as they were at the end of the first play. Figaro, because of his efforts in winning Rosina for the Count, has been promoted to essentially the kind of butler of the house, kind of right-hand man of the Count, and he has fallen in love with the Countess, Rosina's right-hand woman, Susanna. And today, Susanna and Figaro, these two servants, are going to be married. That is the marriage that is referenced in the title of this play and this opera. And when the opera begins, it seems like everything's kind of fine. In fact, in some ways, it seems like the finale of another story. We meet two young servants, they are getting married, they love each other, they're excited about their prospects. Until it is revealed that the room that this opening scene takes place in is their wedding chamber. It is going to be their new apartment, and it is just a couple steps away from the Count's room and the Countess's room. And Susanna freaks out because the Count has evoked what was called the droit de seigneur, the right of the Lord. This was the kind of old medieval horrible kind of a right of a lord to have his way with members of his household on the night of their wedding, because the Count has now set his eyes on Susanna. So this perfect, enlightened, jovial Count is now after the servant, and he's not using enlightenment tactics. He's not being rational like the men were supposed to be in the 18th century. No, he's going to something more backwater, something that is from the past to get what he wants. And that is what sets this play into motion. That Figaro, Susanna, the Countess, and everyone else of a lower class is going to work to humble the Count and subvert world order. If you know the history of the American Revolution or know the show Hamilton by Lin-Manuel Miranda, you know the song that was sung when the American Revolution was taking place. The world turned upside down, that the colonists were beating the incredible empire, the British Empire. Here in the household of Almaviva, we have the servants besting their master. Now put yourself in the mindset of someone who loved the play of Barber of Seville. You're in the aristocracy in Europe, and this is the play that you see. You can immediately grasp its impact. You can immediately say, oh my gosh, this is no longer a fun, frivolous comedy. This is about subverting the world order. This is about saying, down with the aristocracy, albeit with a wink and a nod. That political content is what drew Mozart and Da Ponte to this play and not its predecessor, The Barber of Seville. Now, this play itself, there are kind of reasons that we know that it was so politically charged, and it's not just from the plot. It is also from the character of the playwright himself. Beaumarchais really did put his money where his mouth was. Because Beaumarchais was born to a son of a watchmaker, but quickly established himself in artistic circles. He quickly established himself as someone as kind of a Figaro-like character, a jack of all trades, if you will, and became deeply involved in the political inner workings of the French court. He worked to support the American Revolution even before the French joined the American side, providing arms and eventually leading to the Battle of Yorktown. Beaumarchais smuggled guns to the colonists and the revolutionaries. He smuggled financing, even getting himself into trouble financially by sending money to the colonies. He would later do the exact same thing for the French revolutionaries. So here is this artist, this man who knows something about kind of clever plotting. I'd like to think about the Barber of Seville and the Marriage of Figaro as kind of the inner workings of a clock. It's so quick-witted throughout, but underneath is this deep desire to see change. That's who wrote this story, and that is why it was so incendiary for the time. It's worth noting that the Marriage of Figaro continues in play form with a third play, The Culpable Mother. We will not talk about this play very much. However, because it wasn't published when Mozart was writing The Marriage of Figaro, so what happens with the characters in the third play is just a little less relevant to the way that Mozart conceived of The Marriage of Figaro. So already in our time together, let's take a step back. What have we learned? We've learned that this was based on a political incendiary play that had deep ramifications for European society. And that's one of the reasons that Mozart and Da Ponte chose to set it. We've learned that we are in the second play, which means that these characters of Figaro, Susanna, Dr. Bartolo, Don Basilio, these characters were known to the audience. So if this is your first time approaching The Marriage of Figaro, and the first 20 minutes you're a little kind of jarred, you're not exactly sure who everyone is, that's okay, because it will become clear, because the expectation that Mozart had was everyone kind of knew who these characters were. The plays were known. And so that is the context, that is the world into which we find ourselves when these operas begin. I want to take a quick pause and just say that if you have any comments or questions, please log in through YouTube or through Facebook or wherever you're watching this, and please send me a question. I'll keep regularly checking the comments to my right in order to see if you have anything that I need to explain a different way, if I'm moving too fast, or if you want to know something further about the various points that we are discussing. So I want to now turn our attention to music in the Age of Enlightenment. I want to now kind of zoom from our story and our source material to the music. Mozart is writing towards the end of what we call the Age of Enlightenment, or the classical era in Western music. And I apologize that this slide in uploading kind of chops the word enlightenment in two. But we are coming out of the Baroque, the period of Handel and Bach and Monteverdi, and we have moved to the height of the classical era. And the function of music has changed here. Here are two quotes, one from the end of the Baroque, and then another just a couple decades later into the classical era. And it's going to show you how Western society has changed. At the top, from the Baroque era, music is a gift of God to be used only in his honor. All right, music is divine. It is about inspiration. It is about glorifying something other than yourself. It is not meant for human construction or craft, or at least that's the rhetoric surrounding it. Let's now take a look at what's happening in the Age of Enlightenment in the world of Mozart. It is man who created the arts. He has done so to satisfy his own needs. One of the reasons why the music of the Enlightenment is so popular to this day is because it is conceived on a human level. It is conceived as craft. This is something that is meant to be appreciated on a first listen. This is something that is meant to be read, similar to how we would read a book. This is meant to be able to be digested by everyone. In fact, music in this time period led to what was called the galant style, the noble style. And this is the style of music that Mozart writes in. The national trends that we saw from the Baroque, the Italian, the German, the French, English, etc., all of that still exists. But as music starts to be conceived of as rhetoric, as language, here in this enlightenment, logical, rational age that would bring so much revolution and change to the West, brings about a new style of music of the gallant or noble. It is balanced, it is simple, and excess has been stripped. All of the crazy virtuosity that we see in the Baroque has been pulled away. We have what are called slower harmonic rhythms. That means that chords of the orchestra are going to be slowed down. The chords change less frequently. So it's easier to kind of get into the listening of this music. There's less coming at you, essentially, from the orchestra and from the singer. This music is more homophonic, meaning that it is more song-like. It is filled with a melody and accompaniment. And that melody, that vocal line, is going to be beautiful and song-like. Instruments are going to function like voices, and they are also going to play and sing beautiful melodies. The structure of this music, as I mentioned, is rhetorical. In fact, the way that we analyze music from the classical period, we use terms that you probably learned in English class. We call them periods, we call them sentences. We have these clear musical structures, sonata form. All are coming to fruition here. And you can diagram a work of classical era music just like you can diagram a sentence. And finally, this period really prized emotional realism. And what I mean by that is in one phrase of music, you'll go from kind of beautiful, lovely happiness with then just a little twinge of regret, a little leading tone or accidental or something that tells you that underneath the surface of that happiness is despair. Or if you hear a very sad melody, you're then going to get a little bit of lift there at the end that maybe there is hope here. Emotions, as we know, don't happen happiness and sadness. They're all kind of happening all in one. And so with Mozart, we see this style come to fruition. So when you are listening to the Marriage of Figaro or any of the clips that we'll look at in just a couple of moments, I want you to think about that. Think about the song-like structure. Think about how kind of balanced and rational all of this is. But in listening to it, how human all of these characters are and how emotionally real the situations present themselves. So that's the musical world that Mozart found himself in, where at the end of the classical era, all of these trends are firmly entrenched, and Mozart is going to perfect them. And I now want to turn to Mozart himself. So let's regroup. Talked about the bare bones overview of Le Nozze di Figaro, of the Marriage of Figaro. We talked about the plays upon which this is based. We then talked about Beaumarchais, the playwright who wrote those works, and why this piece was considered so political. And we're now turning our attention to the composer and librettist of this work. And I think it's important to consider Mozart essentially as a four-act opera. His life is easily divided into four, and that is very helpful as we explore his phenomenal work. It's also worth spending some time on Mozart's biography because his life is so misunderstood. As much as I love the movie Amadeus and other kind of popular versions of his life, there is much that needs to be corrected in order to really appreciate what is happening in his works. Mozart spent the bulk of his career in Vienna, and Vienna is a city that I think is worth spending a moment discussing. At the time, it was one of the fastest growing cities in Europe. This was where it was happening. This was, to quote Hamilton again, this was the room where it happens. This is where all of the arts were coming together. Paris was still very important. London was important, but this was the new fresh guy on the block, if you will. The Vienna of the 1700s, 18th century. It was the center of the Holy Roman Empire and was the seat of the Habsburg Empire. So Mozart, when he's in Vienna, he's working with and for Joseph II, the Holy Roman Emperor. Before then, the regent and Empress Maria Theresa. This is the center of political power. And considering what's happening in the news right now, I think it's worth noting that at the time, Vienna was the crossroads of Eastern and Western Europe. This is where everything was filtered towards the West. We tend to not think about it, but it actually was under frequent Ottoman and Turkish threat at various times. It was besieged by invaders, and so it was a city that kind of had an attitude of carpe diem, of seize the day. And I think that's important as we talk about these kind of crossroads of East and West here on this European continent. It established a very strong musical identity. In fact, Vienna is kind of seen as the musical city. We talk about the first Viennese school of Mozart, Beethoven, and Haydn, for example. And it was also an era of a place of political intrigue. The Freemasons, for example, being very prominent, and Mozart participated in those endeavors. We see it right here. Here's the Habsburg Empire. This is Europe of the 18th century, 1700s. And we see it right here on the border of East and West. Again, we cannot divorce politics and contemporary issues of its time with the Marriage of Figaro, which tells us that we shouldn't separate contemporary issues of our time with this great work. Some important characters in Mozart's life. First, his father, Leopold Mozart, who was a musician and composer, and is the one who sent Mozart and his sister around Europe to hear all of the music, to see all the art, and to be the child prodigies that they became known as. Mozart's sister, Anna Maria, or Nannerl, as she was nicknamed, was in many ways equally talented to her brother. And one of the great kind of what ifs of history is if Nannerl had been born a little later and had been able to have the opportunities as a woman in music that were fortunately afforded composers and musicians later in the history of the West. She was an incredible pianist, incredible musician, and I think there is much to consider about the musical life of Nannerl. The family, the Mozart family, was under the patronage of Archbishop Colloredo, who was the ruler of Salzburg. And patronage is a big idea when we talk about Mozart. Mozart is one of the first Western composers who really had the bulk of his career develop as a freelancer. Talk about the world being turned upside down. Thus far in Western society, you did not make it as a musician if you didn't have patronage. And what Mozart does is he throws off the patronage of the Archbishop, moves to Vienna, gets some patronage from Joseph II, but in general, he becomes his own person. He also is representing a Figaro type, just as Beaumarchais put himself onto the stage in his plays. Eventually, Mozart is going to marry his incredible wife, Costanza Mozart, who is kind of given the least concern in a lot of contemporary tellings of Mozart's life, when she herself was amazing. She and her sisters were vibrant, musical young women. Mozart wrote a lot of works for all of the girls in the family, and based on the music that he left behind, where clearly they sounded good, they were amazing. Costanza herself was fluent in many, many languages, and in trying to preserve Mozart's legacy after and succeeding, after he died at a young age, essentially creates the beginning of German copyright law. Like, this woman was amazing. And all of these women are considered beautifully in the book, Mozart's Women, by conductor and writer and musicologist Jane Glover. So if you want to know more about these incredible women in Mozart's life, read that book. Also, when watching The Marriage of Figaro, we can see where the characters of Susanna and the Countess come from. Look at the women who were around him and who he was collaborating with and working with. Really, really phenomenal stuff. Joseph II was the enlightenment rational ruler of the Habsburg Empire as Mozart is coming to his own. And yes, there is a bit of a paradox there. Enlightened ruler. to be a king, but also providing universal or trying to provide universal education, to give freedoms and rights, but still saying, I'm the divinely appointed king. You see the contradiction of the Enlightenment and how we got to events like the French Revolution in the first place. And finally, the last kind of important, character in our cast list of the life of Mozart, we get Lorenzo Da Ponte. A word about Da Ponte. While he's less well known than Mozart, his life was crazy. And no wonder they were each other's equals in writing words and music. Da Ponte was born in Italy, originally Italian, and was born into a Jewish family. However, the family converted to Catholicism when his father remarried. He then became a Catholic priest, moved to Venice, where he had a mistress and a couple kids, which led to complete and utter scandal, as you can imagine, as a Catholic priest, and he fled. And he found his way to the Habsburg Empire, where he became the court poet of Joseph II, collaborated with many composers, and collaborated with Mozart on his three great operas, The Marriage of Figaro, Così fan tutte, and Don Giovanni. We can see that. Then when Joseph II dies and there is regime change in the Habsburg Empire, Da Ponte loses favor and he flees with his mistress to France, and he ends up in America, where he becomes the first professor of the Italian language for Columbia University. He brings the first full-length operas to New York in the early 1800s, establishing what eventually would be the Academy of Music, which eventually, through a whole exchange of old and new money families, would turn into the Metropolitan Opera. Lorenzo Da Ponte is buried in New York City, so you can visit his grave there. And so it's interesting to consider that this legacy, this piece that we view as so distant to ourselves, we as Americans, and especially American opera lovers, can point to a direct trajectory to Lorenzo Da Ponte himself. He wrote a fantastic autobiography. Most of it's probably a lie, but is a fun read nonetheless. So take a look at these people that are in Mozart's life. No wonder his music is filled with such wit, such humanity, and such insight. Famously, his early years, Act 1, he's traveling Europe as a child prodigy. His father, as a musician, can notice musical talent as soon as he sees it, and he and Nannerl head off to all of the cities of Europe. This is very important to understanding the Marriage of Figaro, because Mozart was not just a German-speaking composer. He wasn't just an Austrian composer. He knew what the French were up to. He knew what the English were up to. He knew what the Italians were up to. And he heard the best of those styles. And I would assert that one of the great, brilliant things about Mozart's music is how he's able to assimilate all of this music into his own style. So he's taking the best of Italian vocalism and mixing it with the best German counterpoint, with the best French appreciation of drama and structure. All of these things are coming together, and it comes from his early years traveling around and hearing this music. Mozart famously had an incredible memory. So one of the possibly apocryphal anecdotes of his time traveling with his father as a young boy was they visited the Sistine Chapel in Rome, very sacred place in Roman Catholicism. And there is music that is performed there that is not allowed to be performed anywhere else. So they're hearing the great motets of the Sistine Chapel, and no one really bothered to tell little Mozart that this music can't leave this chapel. So he goes home and plays it by memory, creating a little bit of a scandal. And even if that that story isn't exactly true, it's hard to tell, but it does point to the precocious little snot that Mozart must have been and continue to be as his life progressed. As he grew up, though, as true with many child stars, they have a hard time in adolescence as they get towards adulthood, really breaking out of that shell of the child prodigy, the child actor, the child filled with potential. So he doesn't find satisfaction in the city of Salzburg, where he is from. He doesn't find satisfaction in his father's way of life, of living under the patronage of the Archbishop Colloredo. And so he goes away for a while with his mom. His mom dies very tragically. Nannerl is forced to stay at home, and eventually he breaks out of his shell, and he's able to do that when he escapes to Munich. He gets a commission to write Idomeneo, which is a serious opera, and the first, not the first opera that Mozart wrote, but the first kind of opera that we still perform regularly, that is seen as kind of his first great masterpiece. There, during this time, he meets the Weber family, which has these four incredible women, ends up marrying Costanza the second, after the first one says, I don't like you that way. And he becomes the talk of the town. He moves to Vienna to establish himself as a composer and as an adult with his new family. And with receiving help from the Freemasons, of which he was one himself, manages to kind of cobble together this freelance life, which was something that didn't exist. He was making up a new way to be a musician. He would rent out a theater, he would put together concerts, premiering his works, often playing the piano part or playing the violin. He was a famous improviser, and make money that way. Um, there is somewhat of a misnomer about Mozart's financial life. He was not as much of a spendthrift and bad at money as we like to make it out. There's kind of this legend around Mozart that he was kind of this man baby, if you will, this kind of, spending frivolously and doesn't understand adult life, but is creating this glorious music. It's not exactly how it went down. While he did have financial troubles towards the end, a lot of that had to do with the fact of how political times were changing in Vienna. Upon the death of Joseph II, for example, the theaters had to be shut down. So the piece that he had just premiered to great reviews, Cose fan tutte, that was going to bring in residual funds for months and months on end, boom, shut down, no more money. So those kinds of whims and just bad luck tended to plague the Mozart family. Costanza got very sick at one point and had to receive very expensive treatments in the city of Baden-Baden, which you can still go to for their hot springs and things like that, for the therapies, which was very expensive. And so he wanted to take care of his wife. So they were just kind of unlucky situations that the Mozarts found themselves in, but they were not as irresponsible as we sometimes like to make them appear. He had several children during this period, and writes the bulk of his mature works during this time, Le Nozze di Figaro being one of them. In 1788, as I mentioned, both of them are grappling with illness. Mozart was always a little sickly. As a kid, he'd almost died on the road. And we still to this day don't know exactly what that was, what pathogen kind of got him, suppressed his immune system, whatever it might be. But at this time, remember that medicine wasn't what it was today, and travel was very, very difficult. So to have put that stress on a little kid may have done irreparable damage to his immune system. His final opera that he wrote was La Clemenza di Tito, which is somewhat of an old school opera. It's a genius work. And the last opera that is performed is The Magic Flute, Die Zauberflöte, which he famously loved and attended all of the performances and various things. And he dies at the age of 35 when writing his famous Requiem. He was buried in an unmarked grave. It's worth noting, by the way, we don't actually know what killed him. Some kind of sickness, obviously, maybe mixed with stress, weak heart, weak immune system. As I mentioned, it's a little unclear exactly what happened. We don't know where he's buried. He was buried in an unmarked grave, but he was not forgotten. There again is this kind of myth around Mozart that he was, lost all of his money and they couldn't even afford a tombstone, and was forgotten. That's not how it went down either. While his death was sudden, so the family was not prepared for his death, it was very vogue in Vienna at the time to give everyone paupers' funerals. It was very kind of, seen as, we are all equal, we are all the same. So even members of the aristocracy would be buried in this way. And luckily, Costanza worked to continue his legacy after this untimely death at the age of 35. I'm 32, so I'm looking at kind of what Mozart was doing when he was my age and just am in awe of what I see. So, with all of that said, all of this kind of consideration of Mozart's life and of his work, let's talk a little bit about how to listen to this music and bring back some of the ideas we mentioned earlier about the galant style and his early travel as a child. Mozart brought together all of the salient features of the styles that were prominent at that time: Italian melody, German harmony, French theater. All of these come together. He expanded the scope and the possibilities of all of the genres that he wrote in. And he wrote in every genre he possibly could. He writes opera better than anyone else at the time. He writes symphonies better than anyone else at the time. He writes string quartets better than anyone else on the time. He is taking all of this skill, this clear, balanced, emotionally real style, and brings that to the fore. He adds more harmonic and rhythmic interest than you would see in many of his contemporaries and had this psychological realism. And as I already mentioned, he cements, along with Haydn and eventually Beethoven, the first Viennese school. This is what we think of as classical music. It's worth noting that Haydn knew Mozart. They knew each other pretty well, actually. And Haydn, Joseph Haydn, cried when Mozart died. He was devastated that the person who was seen as his heir apparent, since Haydn was significantly older than young Wolfgang, had died before him. Haydn would eventually meet Beethoven. They were not as cordial with each other, but most people were very cordial with Beethoven. And eventually, Haydn would survive into the 1800s. So the kind of amount of time that has gone by since the time of Mozart is much shorter than we tend to think about it. We think about Mozart as kind of, oh, that's of the past. Not really. We can draw all of these threads back to our contemporary day, and it wasn't that long ago, whether it be the music of Haydn leading to Beethoven, leading on and on to us today, or it's Da Ponte coming to America and helping to establish the musical tradition of America, at least on the Western classical music side of things. The political issues that are present in The Marriage of Figaro, all of these things are much closer to us than we usually imagine. Before we turn to some musical examples and talk about how all of this plays out in real time, I want to put my money where my mouth is with all of these ideas of the politics of this play. One of the things that is genius about how Da Ponte adapted the Beaumarchais play is he managed to keep enough of the political overtones that the story maintains its integrity. This idea of the servants humbling their master and the world order being subverted is still there, but he takes out kind of the extreme rhetoric that exists in the original play. So, as you're watching The Marriage of Figaro, the audience of the day, who is seeing themselves reflected with the action on stage, uh, would have known these parts that were missing and would have been able to fill in the blanks, if you will. So let me give you an example. When you see The Marriage of Figaro, when we get to Act 4, the character of Figaro is at his lowest point. He's essentially been left out of some of the scheming that's been happening, and so he thinks that his wife is going to be unfaithful with the Count. And he has this aria called Aprite, open your eyes and see kind of, what women truly are. And it's kind of a chauvinist aria, as Figaro is kind of painting all women with the same brush. That speech exists in the original play, but it goes way further. And I want to just read an English translation of that part. It's a very lengthy speech of part of that um, that scene, that speech. And so when you see the opera, you, like the audience, can fill in the gaps of what it is that Figaro is really saying. And if you listen to Mozart's music, you hear this revolutionary fire underneath Figaro that feels a little out of place unless you know what the political context of the play truly was. So here is Figaro realizing or thinking falsely that his wife is going to be unfaithful. I even saw her laugh with delight while he read her billet. They think themselves secure, but perhaps they yet may be deceived. No, no, my very worthy lord and master. So now his subject has turned to the count. You have not got her yet. What? Because you are a great man, you fancy yourself a great genius? Which way? How came you to be the rich and mighty Count Almaviva? Why, truly, you gave yourself the trouble to be born, while the obscurity in which I have been cast demanded more abilities to gain a mere subsistence than are requisite to govern empires. And what, most noble count, are your claims to distinction, to pompous titles and immense wealth, of which you are so proud, and which by accident you possess? For which of your virtues, your wisdom, your generosity, your justice? The wisdom you have acquired consists in vile arts to gratify vile passions. Your generosity is lavished on your hireling instruments, but whose necessities make them far less contemptible than yourself. And your justice is the inveterate persecution of those who would have the will and wit to resist your depredations. But this has ever been the practice of little great. Those they cannot degrade, they endeavor to crush. So, what has Figaro just said? He said, I'm better than you because I actually had to work for everything that I get. You just had to be born. And apparently, the skills that it takes just to survive in this world are more involved than the skills that it takes to, be the emperor of Britain or of France. You hear the political rhetoric, you hear that revolutionary fire. That's the fire that will lead to the French Revolution, that will change the Western world forever. So that's the tone, that's the context. That is what is happening underneath all of this fantastic music and drama, and what makes this such a fun opera to consider. So we've now looked at it from all of these different lenses, the life of Beaumarchais and kind of the French influence, the source material, the world and life and times of Mozart and Da Ponte. Let's now look at the work itself, shall we? Let's take a look at how to listen to this great opera. I want to begin with the opening duet, because this is a great example of how you can best listen to this music in this galant style. Very melodic, very kind of stately and noble. Everything's in 4-bar phrases. But you're going to be introduced at the beginning of this as Figaro is measuring the marriage bed in the room with the count's chambers to one side and the countess's chambers to the other. You're going to hear music that is very square. Bum ba dum bum 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 ba dum bum ba dum bum 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 ba dum. That's the music of Figaro. It's very kind of masculine in the kind of enlightenment version of what that word means. It is very square. It is very precise. It has a bouncy rhythm to it. But then you're going to hear a melody even before the characters start to sing. Da 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 da. That music, which has way more notes, it's happening a lot faster and is kind of this circle, this kind of spinning. That's the music of Susanna. So we're going to hear these two characters delineated perfectly in music. The square, slow, rational Figaro, who thinks that he's at the top of things, and then the real one who is causing the wheels to turn, the circular, constantly thinking, constantly planning, constantly coming up with ideas, the incredible humanity of Susanna. And I want you to pay attention whose music is being sung by the end of this duet. This recording does not have super titles. The performance that you will see with Virginia Opera will have super titles. It will have translations. And I'm doing this on purpose. I want us to take a moment and really listen to the music and see how these characters come through in this opening duet. Music of Figaro. Music of Susanna. Measuring the Bed. 5, 10. She's saying, "Look at me," and he's not. He's in his musical world. So, did you notice whose music was being sung by the end? Figaro had picked up the melody of Susanna. So who's in charge in this relationship? Definitely Susanna. She is the one who's calling the shots. She is the one that is moving faster than him, and that is only borne out in the plot. So pay attention to the speed of the music of each character as they sing, as they are characterized by the melody. So even though it sounds just kind of, classical and normal, there is incredible psychological nuance happening here. Another great example of this, and the emotional realism and the characterization that we get in these captivating characters in The Marriage of Figaro, is the character of the Countess. And when we first meet her, she is forlorn because her marriage has fallen apart. Her husband no longer comes to her bedroom. She's depressed, and she sings this aria, this song, saying like, "Love, where did you go? How can I get you back?" And pay attention to the opening melody that she sings, that is first introduced by the melancholy woodwinds and then is turned into the melody of the Countess. And it goes, "Poggi amor, qualche ristoro." It'll be sung better for you in just a moment in this clip, and of course by our incredible Countess Simone Harcourt with Virginia Opera. But notice that little tone there at the end. "Poggi amor, qualche ristoro." That little hope that is brought at the end of that melody, in the midst of this kind of sad lament, the sense that maybe it can get better comes in. A lesser composer, of which there were many in the time of the classical era, would have probably written da 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 da. But that little da 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 makes all the difference in really giving us this the heartbeat of this character who is both lamenting and hopeful, not willing to give up, but still finding herself at a crossroads. Hear that? Hear that hope? That's the emotional realism that we're talking about in this gallant enlightenment style, and how Mozart creates such incredible characterization and drama through his music. A couple more clips for you. Mozart was a master of chaos, and there are many characters who all want different things throughout this story as the servants are trying to better their masters, women are trying to humble men, everything that we think of as enlightenment kind of, patriarchal European culture is being turned on its head. This all comes to fruition at the end of Act 2, when there is just chaos and beauty and shenanigans coming. We actually don't have time right now to listen to that, but pay attention as the second act finale builds, how Mozart is able to delineate the characters who are old school and the characters who are new school, and how all of that is able to be seamlessly balanced as this huge 20-minute scene compiles one on top of the other, on top of the other, on top of the other, while keeping us dramatically interested in our heartbeats beating in time with that music, that revolutionary fire that we sense in this continental global work speaking to us today. I would be remiss in any discussion of the Marriage of Figaro if I didn't mention the end, because I think this is where we need to spend the most time thinking about this piece. Because this whole time I've been talking about politics and talking about kind of the revolutionary moment that Europe found itself in 1786, the world order that was being subverted, the crossroads of East and West, and what does that mean, and what's going to happen? But Mozart gives us an answer, at least his answer, to how this all can unfold and what we need to do in order to do that. And that is, after all of the plans have been revealed, all of the shenanigans and the switching of costumes, so the Countess is actually Susanna, Susanna's the Countess, all kinds of crazy things have happened. I haven't even talked that much about Cherubino, the young boy who finds himself in all kinds of hot water throughout this entire opera. All of this has happened. And it's all revealed at the very end. And when that occurs, the Count does something. And he gives in to the humility that he has been shown, the error of his ways. And he kneels down and says, Countess, I'm sorry. I screwed up. Perdono, pardon me. And the music that Mozart gives us, that true belief that you get in the melody, the complete earnestness of this music points a way forward in the midst of turmoil, in the midst of tumult, how forgiveness, the act of humbling yourself, of admitting that you're wrong, admitting that someone else has a point of view that is valuable, and that maybe you need to do a little soul searching. All of that is what leads to a happy ending. This whole opera, this whole political adventure, this whole microcosm of Europe leads to a moment of humility and a moment of humanity.
Perdono, perdono, no, 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 tanto, perdono, oh, perdono, oh, perdono, no, 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 no.
And Mozart brings us to a moment of true reconciliation at the end of all of this comedy, at the end of all this revolution, at the end of all of this ranting, at the end of all this anger. That's where we were left. It is truly a human moment. And I hope that our production presented in 18th century dress, fabulous production directed by Carl Lang with an incredible young cast of singers bringing these characters to life. I hope that you match them and bring, based on the time that we've had together this evening, bring with you a sense of fire, of energy, of freshness, and of taking the time that we're in the theater together to really sit down and look at our society and look at ourselves reflected on stage. We no longer wear the clothes of the singers and of the characters like they did back in 1786, but we can still bring that energy and hopefully bring a little more love and reconciliation into our broken world. Thank you so much. It has been an absolute joy to be presenting these previews. Got a little bit over time. If you have any questions, I will continue to monitor the Virginia Opera social media feed to answer anything that I need to clarify or re-explain, or any questions that you have about subjects that I didn't address. And I can't wait to see you all at the opera, and I cannot wait to continue joining you on these journeys and singing along as we move into Virginia Opera's wonderful 2022-2023 season. Thank you all. See you at the opera.